Okay, so this is not necessarily a new finding, but I wanted to bring attention to this anyways. The fashion industry, which dominates commercial aspects of uh, people's consumption and international trade, it's a high cost business, not only for people but also the environment. So here I'll start with the World Bank report based on the UNEP figures. So according to the figures from UNEP, it takes 3,781 liters of water to make a pair of jeans from the production of the cotton to delivery of the final product to the store. That equates to the emissions of around 33.4 kilograms of carbon equivalent. Okay, so as general numbers from the I think this is from the Pew Foundation or MacArthur Foundation or some such thing. Every year the fashion industry uses 93 billion cubic meters of water, enough to meet the consumption needs of 5 million people. Around 20% of wastewater worldwide comes from fabric dyeing and treatment. Of the total fiber input used for clothing, 87% is incinerated or disposed of in a landfill. The fashion industry is responsible for 10% of the annual global carbon emissions, more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. That's pretty scary. The McKinsey report quotes a slightly different number, but we'll look at this in a minute. At this pace, the fashion industry's greenhouse gas emissions will surge more than 50% by 2030. If demographic and lifestyle patterns continue as they are now, global consumption of apparel will rise from 62 million metric tons in 2019 to 102 million tons in 10 years. Every year, a million tons of plastic microfibers are dumped into the ocean, the equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. 50 billion with a B. The danger: microfibers cannot be extracted from the water and they can spread throughout the food chain, which we have looked at in another context. World Bank report also quotes from the report, say what consumers can do. I will read it just so that you are aware before I come to the McKinsey report on how fashion industry itself can reduce its emissions. Before buying, ask if the manufacturers used sustainable criteria to make the clothing. Can you do that all the time? You can, but will you get a good answer? You will never know. Be creative in combining garments and recycle them after they wear out. Repair clothing. Donate what you no longer use. Buy only what you need. In some countries, 40% of purchased clothing is never used. 40%. Consider quality over quantity. Every additional year a garment is worn means less pollution. Cheap clothing often doesn't survive the wash cycle, meaning that in the long run you don't save money compared with buying better quality garments. Buy second-hand clothing, be a smart laundry manager, wash full loads and use non-abrasive detergents, for example. As for buy second-hand clothing, living in the US, many of us get used to it, but there are cultural hassles about this. For example, I tried to give my clothes to my nephew, but his mother was not happy because she didn't want him to wear used clothes, even from his own uncle, right? I'm not blaming her, I'm just saying these are cultural mores and cultural inhibitions. So the McKinsey report is titled Fashion on Climate, How the Fashion Industry Can Urgently Act to Reduce Its Greenhouse Gas Emissions. Here the number is fashion industry accounts for around 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the World Bank UNEP report said somewhere here the number, I think it was 10%, but 10% of the annual global carbon emissions, whereas this is talking about greenhouse gases, which include methane, N2O, and CFCs and HFCs. Okay. Just in terms of where the items involved in fashion industry come from, there is upstream production, brand operations, usage and end of use. So the accelerated reduction potential is accounted for each of these in terms of contributions. So apparel and footwear value chain in greenhouse gas emissions in 2018, you can see most of it comes from material production here, 38%, and almost a large fraction obviously comes from upstream production, and then there is usage and end of use. Okay, so that's 23%, and you have brand operations like transport and retail. Just quick run through those. Under its current trajectory, the fashion industry will miss the 1.5 degree pathway by 50%. So I hope you're paying attention to the numbers. This is 2,106 million tons of CO2 equivalent total. Okay, so emissions abatement, assuming no further action or industry decarbonization continues at current pace. So there are already some efforts underway. If they don't accelerate, what will happen? 28 emissions were at 2,106 million tons CO2 equivalent. So converting other greenhouse gases into CO2 using concentrations and global warming potential as we did before. By 2030, emissions under no further action would reach 2,740. If the current pace of decarbonization continues, it'll basically remain the same, which means the gap to 1.5 degree will be about 50%, which is at 1,100 million tons for 1.5 degree pathway. Okay, so that's not good news. Over the next decade, the industry can cut its collective greenhouse gas footprint in half from current levels. So looking at the same numbers here, emissions under accelerated abatement would take it down by 50%, which is what this is saying. So that would be fantastic. What are the key sources of emissions savings under accelerated abatement? 61% is from reducing emissions of the upstream operations which we looked at, manufacturing for example, sourcing materials, etc. Reducing emissions from brand's own operations like transport and retail can save 18%. Encouraging sustainable consumer behaviors would be 21%. How is that going to be done? Not always easy, but in general it turns out that labels like green, sustainable, etc. get consumers' attention. So there is that always, and peer pressure works as well. Emission savings within upstream production under accelerated abatement for upstream production, brand operations, usage, and end use. A total of 1,676 million tons CO2 equivalent coming from decarbonized material production, huge savings from decarbonized material processing, so dyeing and other things, minimized production and manufacturing wastage, and decarbonized garment production with 18% and 21% from brand operations and usage and end use. Okay. Energy related emissions abatement, 63% would come from emissions related to energy levers. The rest would 37% would come from emissions abatement due to other levers. So energy related levers include energy efficiency improvements and energy mix transition in terms of transitions in material processing, garment manufacturing, and retail operation stages, whereas you can get another 16% from switching from coal to electric in material processing stage. This is just a quick run through, but it gives you a sense of the various portfolio items where there is accelerated abatement possible in the fashion industry, which is a serious emitter, right? Emission savings within brand operations under accelerated abatement, again with upstream production, brand operations, and usage and end of use, total of 1676. Again, improved material mix, increased use of sustainable transport, improved packaging, decarbonized retail operations, minimized returns, and reduced overproduction. Okay, so you can see that 61% there again is coming from savings in upstream productions. Okay. Uh, So emissions abatement under accelerated abatement is basically a summary of what we looked at. What is important is to look at the relative additional savings from accelerated abatement. So the current price of trajectory in each item here, for example, decarbonized material, and the big one here in terms of decarbonized material processing, are tiny in the current pace of trajectory, current pace trajectory by 2030 in terms of abatement of emissions, whereas the suggested accelerated abatements would make huge difference, 42% additional abatement possible here. Okay, so this is the total 2030 accelerated abatement, 1,064 million tons CO2 equivalent, which is quite significant. To summarize, summary of fashion industry abatement potential, comparing to 2018 baseline, 2030 no further action, 2030 current pace of trajectory in emissions reductions already in action, and the suggested accelerated abatement potentials. Emissions in million ton CO2 equivalent would go up by 2030 if there is no further action. The current pace of trajectory reduces, basically keeps it the same, whereas accelerated abatement has a potential to reduce it by 50%, which is fantastic. Emissions change, of course, no further action would increase it to 30%. Current pace of trajectory is the baseline, so there is no change with respect to that. But if accelerated abatement is accepted, then the reduction would be 50%, as we saw here. Emissions percentage change versus 2030 with no further action here would be 23% only for current pace trajectory, whereas it would be 60% change reduction if accelerated abatement is accepted. This is the compound annual growth rates, which I'm not going to go into, but basically I guess the argument is the growth rates are not going to be greatly sacrificed by taking this approach of accelerated abatement. Okay, so that's a quick run through the fashion industry, its impacts, what the industry can do to reduce its emissions by 2030, and what individuals can also do to contribute to that, and how industry itself can motivate consumers to pay attention to sustainable approaches. This is not exactly net zero, so I haven't put it under net zero, but I've put it here under new findings because a lot of attention is being paid to the fashion industry and its contributions to greenhouse gases, and there is enhanced awareness and the industry is paying attention, but the current pace of approach to reductions of emissions is not at all sufficient, especially if you want to keep your eye on something like 1.5 degrees C global warming target by 2100 with a 66% probability. Okay, so I will leave it there. Maybe there is some construction sound coming through. I'll check and make sure the sound is okay. All right.